There's a moment in every woman's retirement that nobody warns you about. It's not the party with the cake shaped like a clock. It's not cleaning out your desk or turning in your keys. It's that first Monday morning when you wake up and realize the world kept spinning without you. When your phone stays silent because no one needs your decisions anymore. When you look in the mirror and see someone you haven't met yet, yourself, without a title. If you're watching this at 2 a.m. because you can't sleep, wondering if your best years are behind you, wondering if God's done with you now that your business card says retired, I need you to hear something. This feeling of being erased, this terror that purpose ended when your career did. It's not the conclusion. It's the comma. What if I told you that everything you've built, every skill you've mastered, every scar you've earned, it was all preparation for what's coming next? Not for what you'll do, but for who you'll become when the doing finally stops. I'll create this powerful retirement transformation script for you. Let me start with the full outline and then write it chapter by chapter. Eleanor Grace Mitchell cleared her desk at 4:47 p.m. on a Thursday that should have felt like any other. 32 years of hospital corridors suddenly narrowed to a cardboard box holding a brass nameplate that no longer meant anything. The security badge she'd worn like armor clicked one last time as she turned it in, and somewhere between the parking garage and her car, Eleanor became nobody. The drive home stretched longer than usual. Every red light felt like punctuation at the end of a sentence she hadn't finished writing. Her phone stayed silent. No crisis calls, no urgent emails, no decisions waiting for her signature. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was suffocating. That night, she sat at her kitchen table with retirement papers spread before her like medical charts she'd never diagnose. Her husband asked what she wanted for dinner. For the first time in 3 decades, she had no answer that mattered. The first Monday without an alarm felt like theft. Eleanor woke at 5:15 a.m. anyway, muscle memory pulling her from sleep toward meetings that no longer existed. She made coffee for 2 travel mugs before remembering she had nowhere to travel. The second mug sat on the counter like an accusation while morning news played stories she'd once needed to know for budget meetings that would happen without her. Her LinkedIn profile still said hospital administrator, because changing it to retired felt like writing her own obituary. Former colleagues posted about initiatives she'd started, using language she'd crafted, in meetings rooms where her chair now held someone else. Each notification was a small violence proof that the machine kept running without her hand on the wheel. By noon, she'd reorganized the pantry twice and answered every non-urgent email from the past month. Her daughter called to ask how freedom felt, and Eleanor couldn't explain that freedom and erasure wore the same face. When her husband found her crying over a spreadsheet she'd made for grocery shopping color-coded with pivot tables, he didn't laugh. He just held her while she whispered, "I don't know how to be nothing." Eleanor had built her entire theology around usefulness. Every sermon she'd heard for 40 years seemed to confirm it. Faith without works. Serving the least of these. Being a good steward. She'd translated every verse into metrics. Patients served, budgets balanced, problems solved before breakfast. Her worth lived in quarterly reports and performance reviews. In the grateful tears of families whose loved ones received care because she'd fought insurance companies like Jacob Wrestling Angels. Now she stood in her home office, staring at a blank calendar that might as well have been a mirror showing her what remained when the doing stopped. She'd tried volunteering at the church food pantry, but they wanted her to sort cans, not restructure their supply chain. The library board met monthly, not daily. Every offer to help came with gentle reminders to just relax and enjoy retirement, as if enjoyment could fill the crater where purpose used to live. That evening, she pulled out her Bible and found every underlined verse was about working, serving, producing fruit. The margins held notes from decades of conferences about leadership, excellence, impact. Not a single annotation about being still. Not one highlight about worth that wasn't tied to output. The word she'd stood on for 60 years suddenly felt like it was written in a language she'd never learned. At 2:33 a.m., Eleanor sat in her living room watching shadows move across walls that had witnessed her rise at 4:34 3 decades. The grandfather clock her team had given her at retirement ticked like a metronome, counting measures of nothing. She'd been retired for 17 days, and each one stretched like pulled taffy, sweet but thin, ready to snap under the weight of its own emptiness. Her phone stayed dark. No emergencies required her wisdom. No young administrators called seeking mentorship. The competence she'd honed like a blade now cut only air. She found herself creating crises just to solve them, complicated meal plans that required 6 stores, home projects that demanded Gantt charts, a garden design with ROI calculations for vegetables she didn't even like. The silence wasn't just external. Inside, where purpose used to hum like hospital generators, she heard only her own breathing. She'd spent 40 years being the person with answers, the steady hand in chaos, the one who could make hard calls before first coffee. Now the hardest call was admitting that without decisions to make, she couldn't recognize her own voice. Without problems to solve, she couldn't find her own worth. Without someone needing her expertise, she wondered if she existed at all. Eleanor's prayers had always been efficient, bullet points delivered between meetings. Thanksgiving offered while checking emails, intercession multitasked with morning runs. Now she knelt beside her bed at 6:17 a.m., with unlimited time and nothing to say. The words that once flowed like presentations stuck in her throat like she'd forgotten her native language. "What now, God?" came out as accusation more than question. 40 years of faithful service, and this was her reward. An empty house and a full calendar with nothing but white space. She'd tithed, served, led with integrity, made decisions that honored him even when they cost her politically. The retirement she'd earned felt like exile she didn't deserve. 3 mornings later, still kneeling, still asking, she heard something in the silence that wasn't an answer but an invitation. Not what now, but who now? Not what should I do, but who was I before the doing? The question terrified her more than any budget crisis ever had. Because Eleanor Grace Mitchell, stripped of her title and tasks, wasn't sure she'd ever known. She'd been so busy being useful to God that she'd forgotten He loved her before she'd ever produced a single thing. Eleanor discovered that purpose after 60 was like trying to plant a garden in November. Everything felt too late, too cold, too finished for new growth. Friends who'd retired before her spoke in past tense. "I used to run a department. I was someone who made things happen." Their identities had become museums, carefully preserved but fundamentally historical. She attended a retirement planning seminar at church, where they discussed hobbies and travel. But nobody mentioned the vertigo of waking up unnecessary. The facilitator, barely 40, chirped about golden years, while Eleanor wondered if gold was just another word for sunset. Beautiful but fading, valuable but no longer currency. When they broke into small groups to share dreams, everyone talked about grandchildren, as if purpose could be outsourced to the next generation. That afternoon, she sat with her journal and tried to write a vision statement for her remaining years, the same exercise she'd led hundreds through in strategic planning. The page stayed blank for an hour. Every idea felt like a consolation prize. Tutoring, but she wasn't a teacher. Consulting, but who wanted advice from yesterday's leader. Writing memoirs, but who cared about battles and wars already won. Purpose at 60 felt like trying to download new software on hardware designed for different programs possible, perhaps, but nothing quite fit the way it should. At 7:45 p.m., Eleanor found herself in a Barnes & Noble self-help aisle, surrounded by books about reinventing yourself after retirement. The covers promised new beginnings. Second acts, Phoenix rises from career ashes. She pulled 3 into her arms, then put them back. Starting over suggested her first 60 years had been prologue, practice runs for something that hadn't happened yet. But sitting in her car afterward, watching rain pattern the windshield, she remembered something her grandmother once said while teaching her to make bread. "You don't throw away the starter, child, you feed it, let it rest, then watch it work different." Eleanor had been trying to throw away everything she'd been, thinking retirement meant erasure and rebuilding. But what if it meant something else entirely? That night, she came across the phrase "soul flowing" in a devotional her sister had sent months ago, still unopened until now. It described a way of being that wasn't about producing or proving, but about allowing God's rhythm to move through. You like water through a riverbed you'd already carved through years of faithful service. Not starting over, flowing forward. Not new purpose, purpose transformed. Eleanor felt something shift, like tumblers in a lock finally aligning. Maybe she didn't need to become someone new. Maybe she needed to let who she'd always been flow into spaces productivity had never allowed her to fill. Eleanor found the note tucked in her Bible at Psalm 92-14. "They shall still bear fruit in old age," written in her mother's handwriting 20 years ago, a week before the cancer took her. She'd been reading through sympathy cards, looking for distraction, when the worn paper fell onto her lap like a message delivered through time. Her mother had been 63, planning retirement that never came. The verse hit different at 60 than it had at 40. Then, it was a distant promise. Now, it was either truth or cruel fiction. Eleanor traced the faded ink and wondered what fruit looked like when your branches no longer held the weight of institutions. What harvest came from fields you no longer managed? The Holy Spirit whispered something that sounded like different fruit, deeper roots. 2 days later, a young nurse from the hospital called, not for advice about budgets or politics, but about faith. How did you hold on to God through all those impossible decisions? How did you choose between equally terrible options and still sleep at night? Eleanor spent 2 hours on that call, sharing not strategies but stories, not solutions but surrender. When they hung up, she realized she'd just done something 32 years of administration had never allowed. Ministered from her wounds instead of her wins. God wasn't finished with her. He was just getting to the parts productivity had covered up. Eleanor's hearing had always been selective, tuned to frequencies of crisis, calibrated for problems that needed solving. She could detect political undercurrents in board meetings, hear unspoken budgetary threats, identify system failures from 2 departments away. But sitting in her garden at dawn, she realized she'd forgotten how to hear anything that wasn't urgent. Birds had been singing outside her office window for 3 decades. When had she last noticed? Her husband had been trying to tell her about his own retirement fears for months. But she'd been too busy managing her own collapse to hear his voice shake. The Holy Spirit had probably been whispering all along, but his voice didn't come with deadline alerts or priority flags. She started a practice that felt like learning a new language, sitting still for 15 minutes each morning with no agenda except attention. The first week was torture. Her mind compiled lists, solved hypothetical problems, drafted emails to no one. The second week, she heard her heartbeat slow. By the third week, she heard something else, guidance that came not as marching orders but as gentle suggestions. Call Patricia, read Isaiah 58. Make soup. Small promptings that required no strategic planning, only obedience. Eleanor was learning that God's voice grew clearer when the noise of necessity finally stopped. Eleanor had mastered the art of productive waiting, phone calls during traffic, emails during boarding, strategic planning during medical procedures. But this waiting was different. Barren, she was waiting without knowing what for, sitting in a divine anteroom with no appointment scheduled. The space between her old life and whatever came next stretched like a desert between Egypt and promise. She tried to fill it at first. Online courses abandoned after 2 modules. Craft projects a half-knitted scarf, tangled in judgment. Travel plans canceled when she realized she was running from, not toward. Each attempt at motion felt like Sarah trying to help God with Ishmael human solutions to divine timing. The waiting persisted, patient and terrible. Week 6 of retirement, she surrendered. Sat on her back porch with chamomile tea growing cold, and let the waiting wash over her like baptism. That's when she understood. This wasn't delay, it was preparation. Not punishment, but purification. Every moment of unbearable stillness was burning away 40 years of striving, creating space for something she couldn't yet see. The waiting itself was holy ground, requiring bare feet and reverence. Eleanor stopped asking how long, and started asking how deep. How deep could this hollowing go? How empty did she need to become for God to fill her with something entirely new? The prompting came at 10:22 a.m. on a Tuesday. Visit Marianne. Eleanor hadn't spoken to Marianne Chen in 2 years, not since the board meeting where they disagreed about staffing cuts. The instruction made no strategic sense, served no visible purpose, had no deadline attached. Old Eleanor would have scheduled it 3 weeks out, after proper preparation. But soul-flowing Eleanor grabbed her keys. Marianne answered the door in a bathrobe at 2 p.m., eyes swollen from crying. Her husband had been diagnosed that morning, pancreatic cancer, stage 4. She'd been about to call someone, anyone, but couldn't think who would understand the terrible mathematics of loving someone whose expiration date had just been stamped. Eleanor did understand. Not from experience, but from emptiness that had taught her how to hold space for unbearable things. They sat for 3 hours. Eleanor didn't offer solutions, didn't create action plans, didn't project manage grief. She just obeyed the next gentle prompting. Make tea. Then, listen to the whole story. Then, pray. But quietly. Each instruction came exactly when needed. No sooner, no later. This was obedience without deadlines, following not a strategic plan, but a divine choreography that revealed itself one step at a time. When Eleanor finally left, Marianne whispered, "How did you know to come?" Eleanor's answer surprised them both. "I'm learning to flow." Eleanor's original calling had come at 19, kneeling at a youth revival, promising God she'd serve wherever He placed her. Healthcare administration hadn't been the dream. She'd imagined missionary work, translation, frontline ministry. But doors opened toward hospitals, and she'd walked through them faithfully. Assuming calling meant career, vocation meant job title. 40 years later, she wondered if she'd misunderstood the assignment. Prayer walking at dawn through her neighborhood, she noticed things invisible during working years. The elderly woman who watched from her window, the young mother struggling with 3 kids and groceries, the veteran who sat on his porch from sunrise to sunset, going nowhere. These weren't problems to solve, but people to see. And seeing them, really seeing them, felt like something cracking open in her chest. The calling hadn't been to healthcare systems, but to healing. Not to administration, but to advocacy. Not to management, but to mercy. The job had been the container, not the content. Now, without institutional walls, her calling spilled into unexpected spaces. Prayer texts to former colleagues at 3 a.m. Grocery runs for neighbors who couldn't drive. 3-hour conversations with her grandson about why God lets hard things happen. Eleanor wasn't rediscovering her calling. She was discovering it had always been bigger than any building could hold. The church committee meeting ran 40 minutes over because nobody could agree on the fellowship hall renovation budget. Old Eleanor would have seized control, created spreadsheets, forced consensus through sheer competence. But soul-flowing Eleanor sat quietly, watching dynamics dance like familiar choreography. When they finally asked her opinion, she spoke just 3 sentences that shifted everything. What if we asked what God wants to happen in that space? Budget follows vision, not the reverse. I learned that through 30 years of building the wrong things beautifully. Her wisdom had aged like wine in retirement's cellar, less sharp, more complex, with notes that only emerged after breathing. She found herself serving differently, mentoring without managing, advising without controlling, contributing without conquering. Young leaders sought her out not for her networks or knowledge, but for something richer, perspective born from having been wrong enough times to recognize wisdom's quiet voice. Tuesday afternoons, she met with Ashley, the new hospital administrator who'd inherited Eleanor's position and problems. But instead of tactical advice, Eleanor offered something more valuable: permission to fail, to doubt, to admit overwhelming. Your urgency isn't the same as God's timing, she'd say, remembering her own frantic years. Most crises aren't. The real emergency is losing yourself in the efficiency. Eleanor was learning that wisdom served best when it had nowhere urgent to be. Eleanor's Fitbit had tracked 10,000 steps daily for a decade. Hospital corridors conquered. Problems paced out. Anxiety walked off at precisely 3.7 miles per hour. Now she walked her neighborhood at speeds that would have driven her insane 6 months ago. Stopping when Mrs. Patterson needed to discuss her cat's diabetes. Pausing when the sunset demanded attention. Sitting on bus stop benches with nowhere to catch. God's pace felt like walking underwater at first. Everything too slow, too fluid, too resistant to her normal velocity. She'd start her day with lists, then watch them dissolve as divine interruptions redirected her path. The phone call from a struggling friend during her scheduled Bible study. The prompting to bake bread when she'd planned to organize files. The sudden need to sit with her husband while he tied fishing flies, saying nothing productive for an entire afternoon. By month 4 of retirement, she'd stopped wearing her Fitbit, stopped measuring distance covered, calories burned, efficiency maximized. Instead, she measured moments, how long she could sit in prayer without checking time, how deeply she could listen without forming responses, how fully she could be present without calculating next moves. God's pace wasn't slower, it was deeper, not inefficient, just interested in different destinations than her GPS had ever programmed. The call came from Rwanda at 11:47 p.m. Dr. James Ntakiru Timana, whom Eleanor had met once at a global health conference 15 years ago, somehow had her number. His English, careful and urgent. Mrs. Mitchell, we are building a rural hospital. We have doctors, we have funding, but we don't know how to make systems that sustain. Could you help us think? Eleanor almost said no. She was retired. It was too far, too complicated. But soul flowing had taught her to pause before refusing. In the pause, she heard it. This, I saved you for this. Not a second career, but a sacred assignment. Not rebuilding her identity, but pouring out what she'd gathered. 2 weeks later, she was on Zoom with 7 Rwandan healthcare workers, teaching not from PowerPoints but from scars, sharing not best practices but biggest failures and what they'd taught. The assignment expanded organically. Weekly calls became monthly curricula. Her 32 years of American healthcare suddenly translated into something universal: how to build healing systems that honored both efficiency and humanity. She wasn't consulting, she was midwifing, helping birth something that would outlive her. Eleanor realized retirement hadn't ended her usefulness. It had freed her to be useful without needing credit, payment, or position. The assignment had been waiting for her to become empty enough to hold it. Eleanor's Apple Watch used to buzz with stress notifications during board meetings. Heart rate elevated, time to breathe, stand up, move. 6 months into retirement, it had gone quiet. Not because life had no challenges, but because challenges no longer felt like combat. The Rwandan hospital project faced massive obstacles. Her husband's arthritis worsened, her daughter's marriage strained. Yet Eleanor felt steady, like a boat that had finally learned to ride waves instead of fighting them. She discovered peace wasn't the absence of problems, but the presence of perspective. When the Rwandan team called panicking about government regulations, she listened without absorbing their anxiety. When her sister criticized her wasting retirement on free consulting, Eleanor didn't defend, just smiled. When insomnia visited at 2 a.m., she no longer strategized through it, but sat with God in the darkness, letting peace be its own productivity. Her doctor, reviewing her quarterly checkup, looked puzzled. Your blood pressure is better than it's been in 20 years. What medication did we change? Eleanor laughed. I stopped trying to control the universe. Turns out it runs fine without my management. The doctor, who'd treated her through decades of workplace stress, just stared. Most executives take 5 years to learn that, if they ever do. Eleanor thought about soul flowing, about divine pacing, about the peace that came from flowing with God's current instead of generating her own. I had a good teacher, she said. Eleanor watched her granddaughter's dance recital from the 3rd row, fully present for the first time in memory. No phone on silent, no mental rehearsal of tomorrow's presentations, no multitasking behind a program. Just presence. The 6-year-old forgot her routine halfway through, stood frozen while music continued. Old Eleanor would have felt secondhand performance anxiety, calculated recovery strategies. Soul-flowing Eleanor just sent love across the footlights, watching her granddaughter find courage to improvise the rest. This was purpose without performance metrics, unmeasurable but undeniable. She'd spent 40 years confusing the two, believing purpose required proof, validation, applause. Now she discovered purpose in conversations that changed nothing visible. Sitting with her brother through his divorce depositions, teaching her neighbor's teenager to drive, reading the entire Harry Potter series aloud to her husband during his recovery from knee surgery. The Rwandan hospital opened its doors on a Thursday Eleanor would never see, with systems she'd helped design but wouldn't manage. They sent photos, patients in beds she'd never count, served by staff she'd never supervise, following protocols she'd taught but wouldn't enforce. Her name appeared nowhere on the building, and for the first time in her professional life, anonymity felt like freedom. Purpose had separated from performance, and both were better for the divorce. Autumn came early to Columbus that year, leaves turning while summer's heat still lingered. Eleanor sat on her porch each morning, watching the maple tree release what it had held all season, not in defeat but in rhythm, making space for something dormant to wake. She'd fought this season of her life like she'd fought every transition, with spreadsheets and strategic plans. Now she understood. Some changes weren't problems to solve, but graces to receive. Soul flowing had taught her to read her life like farmers read weather, accepting seasons, working with rather than against natural progressions. The energy that once fueled 16-hour days now concentrated into 4 profound hours. The network that once spread across healthcare systems now deepened into 12 essential relationships. The influence that once moved budgets now moved hearts, one conversation at a time. She'd started attending the 5 a.m. prayer gathering at church, not from discipline but from desire. Drawn to silence before the world woke up demanding things. The other women there, all over 50, all carrying their own retirement adjustments, became her unexpected congregation. They called themselves nothing official, just the Dawn Patrol, but Eleanor recognized church when she saw it. Together they were learning that flowing into a new season didn't mean accepting decline. It meant partnering with a different kind of abundance, deeper roots, sweeter fruit, shade for others climbing. Eleanor's faith before retirement had been industrial strength, built to withstand board politics, ethical dilemmas, and impossible decisions made on 4 hours sleep. It was armor, strategy, survival tool. She'd worn verses like tactical gear, Philippians 4:13 for endurance, Proverbs 31 for excellence, James for taming her tongue in meetings where she wanted to flip tables. Faith had been her competitive advantage in a brutal system, but soul-flowing faith was different. Less armor, more atmosphere, less weapon, more water. She found herself drawn to verses she'd never highlighted. Be still and know. In quietness and trust is your strength. He leads me beside still waters. Her prayer life shifted, from battle plans to conversation, from negotiation to communion. She stopped asking God to bless her plans and started asking to recognize His. The refinement hurt, like silver in fire. Retirement burned away 40 years of religious performance, leaving something purer but smaller, clearer but quieter. She grieved the loss of her warrior faith even while recognizing what remained was more precious. At the Dawn Patrol gathering, she shared this transformation, and Patricia, retired teacher of 35 years, nodded. Honey, he's not changing your faith. He's just showing you it was always bigger than your job could hold. Now you got room to let it breathe. At 4:15 a.m. on the first anniversary of her retirement, Eleanor sat in the darkness with a photo album she hadn't opened in decades. Pictures of herself at 25, fresh-faced at her first healthcare job, 35 pregnant with her daughter while finishing her master's, 45 accepting an award she'd thought defined her worth. But between the formal shots were others, laughing at a church picnic, painting badly at a wine night, holding her newborn grandson with tears streaming down her face. God whispered in the pre-dawn quiet, Remember her? The one who sang off-key in worship, who wrote poetry no one read, who dreamed of opening a shelter for teenage mothers. Eleanor had buried that woman under decades of professional necessity, thinking maturity meant murder of the impractical parts. But soul flowing had been resurrection work, God rolling away stones she'd placed on portions of her heart. She started a list of things she'd loved before she'd become someone important. Watercolor painting terrible but joyful, cooking without recipes, reading fiction that served no purpose except delight, dancing in her kitchen to Motown while making dinner. One by one, she invited these exiled parts home. Not as hobbies to fill retirement's void, but as essential pieces of who she'd always been beneath the titles. God wasn't introducing her to someone new. He was reacquainting her with someone he'd never forgotten, someone he'd loved all along, someone who'd been waiting 60 years to fully breathe. Eleanor stood at the edge of Lake Erie on a February morning, wind cutting through her coat like truth through pretense. 61 years old, 18 months retired, watching waves that didn't care about her resume. She'd come here to make a decision, accept a lucrative consulting contract that would resurrect her old life, or continue this terrifying journey of soul flowing into unknown purpose. Fear had been her secret engine for 40 years, fear of failure, irrelevance, not enough, too much. It had driven her to excellence, but excellence had nearly driven her to exhaustion. Now fear whispered different threats. You're wasting your expertise. You're becoming invisible. You're going to die having mattered to no one. But soul flowing had taught her to recognize fear's voice, how it always spoke in ultimatums and never in invitations. She pulled out her phone and declined the consulting offer with 3 sentences. No explanation, no apology. Then she drove to the community center, where she'd been volunteering, teaching formerly incarcerated women how to navigate healthcare systems. They didn't know her old titles, didn't care about her degrees. They just knew she showed up every Wednesday with homemade cookies and hard-won wisdom about starting over. Walking through those doors without fear of being insignificant, Eleanor finally understood. She wasn't walking away from her purpose. She was walking deeper into it than any career had ever allowed. Eleanor's journal entry on her 62nd birthday filled 3 pages with names. Not networking contacts or professional references, but souls she'd touched in the 2 years since retirement. Mary Ann, whose husband's final months held more peace because Eleanor knew how to sit with dying. Ashley, who'd learned to lead without losing herself. 23 women from the community center, who now had health insurance and doctors who listened. The Rwandan hospital staff who sent videos of babies born in the maternity ward she'd helped design from her kitchen table. Purpose hadn't ended at retirement. It had finally taken off its uniform and revealed its true face. It looked like her grandson calling at midnight with questions about God and suffering, knowing she'd answer without judgment. Like the Dawn Patrol prayers that had become a movement. Christian women over 50 gathering across the city at 5 a.m., not from discipline but from hunger for something real. Like the watercolors she painted badly but bravely, gifting them to friends who hung them up because they carried joy if not skill. Standing in her garden that evening, Eleanor understood what soul flowing really meant. It wasn't about productivity or peace, achievement or acceptance. It was about letting God's purpose flow through you like water through a vessel you'd spent 60 years becoming. The vessel had been shaped by every triumph and failure, every title gained and lost, every moment of grinding and growing. But the water that had always been his, her husband found her there at sunset. Dirt under her nails from planting bulbs that wouldn't bloom until spring. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Eleanor smiled, remembering that first terrible day when her badge clicked for the last time. "I'm thinking about how retirement was never about ending. It was about finally beginning what I'd been preparing for all along." The bulbs would bloom in April. She'd be 63 then, the age her mother never reached. But Eleanor would be there, flowing with purpose that ran deeper than any performance review could measure. Serving from a well that corporate life had dug, but only soul flowing could fill. She wasn't retired, she was refined, released, and finally, fully alive. My beautiful sister, if you're sitting in the ruins of what used to be your identity, wondering if 60 is too late to matter, too old to transform, too finished to flow, remember Eleanor's story. Remember that retirement isn't God's period at the end of your sentence. It's his semicolon. There's more coming, and it's going to be different than anything productivity ever taught you to expect. Soul flowing isn't about finding new ways to be busy. It's about discovering that your purpose was never about your position. It's about learning that God's been preparing you for 60 years to do something only someone with your exact wounds, wisdom, and willingness can do. The world doesn't need another rushed executive. It needs a woman who's learned to flow with divine timing, who serves from overflow instead of obligation, who knows that 5 a.m. prayers matter more than board meetings ever did. Your retirement isn't a loss, it's a release. Not an ending, but an unveiling. Everything you were is still there, just freed from the container that was always too small to hold it. Tomorrow morning, before the world wakes up and tells you who you're supposed to be, sit in the silence and listen. That whisper you hear, that's not nostalgia for who you were. That's invitation to who you're becoming. The title on your business card has disappeared, yes, but your calling just got bigger than any building could ever hold. Welcome to Soul Flowing After 60. Welcome to purpose that doesn't clock out. Welcome to the beginning you've been preparing for your whole life. The Dawn Patrol is waiting for you. We gather at 5 a.m., not because we have to anymore, but because we finally understand what we're waking up for.